afternoon, everybody, and welcome once again to FSC Connect. And this afternoon, we are looking at the question, are you cyber ready? We are delighted to welcome Andrew Parker, who is one of the directors from PwC in their cyber threat operations team, which he has been in for the last 10 years, coming from a background of approximately 25 years in experience, focusing on security and risk for the last 20 years. Andrew is going to be touching today on what he has seen in this space in response to incidents and research, why attackers conduct these types of attacks, and providing an example of attack, and what would have helped and takeaways that you can go back to your teams and discuss internally. At the end of his session, we will be opening up to any questions that you might have. So please, throughout the presentation, if any questions arise, please put them in the Q&A box and Andrew will answer them at the end. And as with all FSC webinars, they will be available on our YouTube page and also on our website. So handing over to you, Andrew.
Thank you very much. Hello everyone, thanks for inviting me today. Just following that introduction, basically what I'm going to talk through is some of the incidents and insights from some of those attacks that we have seen as part of our service to help organizations respond to some of those incidents, and touch a little bit about I suppose why we're seeing more an increase in attacks at the moment, and how they actually impact organizations when they do get attacked. Just a further point about me. I'm a director in the Cyber Threat Operations Division in PwC. Broad responsibilities cover three main areas, which is incident response, helping clients respond to incidents when they occur, running our 24/7 managed cyber defense service, and also some responsibilities around our penetration testing and red teaming team as well. So I suppose the first point is kind of what's driving this increased cyber risk at the moment. And I think to a certain extent it's a conspiracy of circumstances. There's four key points to this, I think. Awareness of New Zealand in the global context, I think, is one of those key points. The ease of which attacks can be executed is a key point, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. The return on investment that they get over this, it's a very lucrative market to be in, and ultimately the level of risk, at least for the attacker, from the attacker's perspective, is it's pretty low. There's depending on where they're operating from, there's almost little to no comeback, unfortunately, when trying to pursue these through to prosecution, if you can get to the territory that they're working out of. So one area in particular that I want to talk about is ransomware, because that is one of the most prevalent types of attack that we're seeing on organizations, and it's quite an interesting business model that we talk about when we look at ransomware. So from the attacker perspective, there's an opportunity cost for them to an opportunity for revenue rather, that is pretty significant. That dollar value of 520 million is an estimate from one single ransomware group called Nephilim, that our threat intelligence team track, and that's what our estimates based on what they're targeting as revenue every year, which is pretty significant. the cost to actually set up the infrastructure to do this, it's actually, in the context of that as a revenue number, it's pretty cheap. $20,000 to $100,000 a year to keep the infrastructure and maintain that. The risk, as I've said, almost next to nothing. Depending on which territory that attackers are operating out of, where they have, I suppose, little to no cybercrime law, it's very difficult to pursue these organizations when you're crossing borders. It's quite difficult even when you have arrangements in place with other countries and good relationships between law enforcement agencies. It's still quite hard in those territories. Never mind ones where the laws are slightly less robust. From the organization perspective or the victim perspective, well, the opportunity is, I suppose there's an opportunity to increase the trust or gain a strategic advantage if you can avoid these things or protect yourself against these things. The cost to do that depends on the organization, but broadly we see cyber capabilities within an IT team to be around 5 to 15% of the organization's IT budget, or ultimately, if you do get compromised, the cost of the recovery itself, which can be in the millions. The risk around this could be the whole business. We've seen a number of organizations that actually don't survive a significant ransomware attack. If you have cyber insurance in place, often one of the first questions your insurers ask you is whether you consider whether or not the business remains viable after the ransomware attack, which is, for some organizations, it's a little bit of a shock to even consider answering that question in the middle of the event. So I've talked a little bit about one group that targets organizations, but in terms of the overall cybercrime industry, there's a number of reports that create this that have estimated this kind of this amount, but broadly by next year they estimate the trade to be worth about six trillion, which is mind blowing to me, not least of which you, I'm sure. That's larger than the trade in heroin, cocaine, and marijuana combined. And interestingly, one of the things that we've seen over the last 9 months is that traditional organized crime groups have lost revenue because of COVID lockdowns, and they're seeking to diversify what they want to do in terms of targeting alternative revenue streams. And cybercrime is one of those that is being targeted, and that's one of the reasons why we're seeing an uptick in cyber attacks. So just to put a little bit of this in context for New Zealand, we're a relatively high trust society. We like to think the best of everyone. We assume everybody's doing the right thing, but we also don't like to be told what to do. And as a result, we're fairly low in regulation in the sector. So apart from specific drivers for very specific market segments, so I'm thinking specifically banking here would be, there's certain associated regulation like the BS11, which requires banks to be resilient. It touches on cyber, but not completely. Where there's an influence from Australia, we have the APRA requirements that that specifically talk about cyber controls and things like that. But broadly speaking, there is a very low regulation that is, from a compliance perspective, for cybersecurity in New Zealand. And to further put that in a little bit of context as well, we did some work to create the Digital Trust Insights reports last year. And we found that only 16% of organizations were very comfortable about the security controls that they had in place. But in the same breath, they didn't want to have testing of those controls mandated across them, or often they don't test those controls themselves. So it's quite an interesting scenario. And again, in terms of the way that that cybercrime is increasing at the moment, and attacks are increasing at the moment, one of the other things that we think is as an important point around this is the way that, or the profile that New Zealand in general has, or has had over the last 8 or 9 months, and that's partly as a result of COVID and the perception of the country's response to COVID. And often when we see attackers track trends, whether that's through excuse me, through Google, through social media, things like Twitter trends, things like that, we see that they use those trends as a basis for their attacks. And the reason why they do that is if they can target target those trends, then they get more bang for the buck in terms of what they're doing or delivering in terms of attacks. So some of those things in terms of the awareness around these has been going on for quite a while. I've talked about that increasing increase in awareness around New Zealand in particular. This headline from end of June, I think this was a little late in my personal opinion. We were seeing significant amounts of ransomware occurring from the beginning of this year, and I've been involved in at least half a dozen responses that have been directly related to ransomware attacks, and not least of which is some of the ones that you've seen in the media where organizations that are both local and international have been affected. But we're not also seeing ransomware attacks. We're also seeing other types of attacks. And I suppose it'd be remiss of me not to mention NZX from a few weeks ago, which I'm sure most of you are aware of, where they had a denial of service attack. And for those of you who don't know what that is, it's basically like sending a lot of requests to look at their services all at the same time. So it's trying to think of it as an equivalent of trying to get your car into your garage when a million other people are trying to get their car into your garage at the same time. You know, you're not going to get into the garage, you're not going to get into the drive or the street, or maybe not even the subdivision. So it's a kind of similar principle. So NZX were a victim of that. Now, the biggest challenge for them was not their actual trading systems. From what I understand, they weren't affected at all. The biggest challenge for them was their website, which formed part of their reporting mechanism. And because they couldn't report, that meant they had to stop trading. The interesting thing about the attackers who did that were that they'd done their homework to understand what the profile of NZX looks like from the internet, and target specifically those services that are available over the internet. and then when NZX and its service providers attempted to block any traffic coming from overseas, the attackers pivoted quite quickly to only target them from local New Zealand IP addresses, which meant that they were not only monitoring the NZX and what they were doing, but they were also monitoring traditional media and social media to understand responses and take action to deal with that at the same time. So it's a very interesting situation. Just specifically around ransomware, and I mentioned we've dealt with a number of attacks since the beginning of the year, or certainly an increased level of them. In context, we as a country were typically down the list for ransomware attacks previously. We were behind the likes of Australia and Hong Kong and Japan across the Asia Pac region. We're actually seeing primarily three groups who are targeting New Zealand specifically. I've noticed some of those at the bottom, and one of the attacks I'm just going to talk through briefly was attributed to one of those groups. So I suppose what happens in a ransomware attack? Well, traditionally, and you might have been exposed or seen one of these emails that a phishing email that you may have received to say, please open this document, please click on this link, and either the link or the document contains some sort of malicious software that may encrypt or deny you access to your files on your machine or computer. The attacks and the approaches that we're seeing attackers make now are far more sophisticated than that. In summary, and this is they take about a 4-stage approach to this generally. First of all, rather than just send you a phishing email and hope that they encrypt a machine, they will deliberately target the organization to find vulnerabilities and gain access to the internal systems. So that's breaking in over the internet, and sometimes they might actually use a phishing email to do that. They may use alternative means as well, such as unpatched vulnerabilities in publicly facing systems. And we've seen that happen in at least 3 of the ones that I've helped manage over the last 6 or 8 months. So once they're inside, they then take their time. They take their time to look around, find out what is sensitive, what they consider might be interesting data that your organization or operations might rely on. Often that might be financial information, business operations, potentially IP, intellectual property. It could be HR information. It could be a whole range of things. One example that I helped manage recently was where the attackers had actually gone through their servers and looked for all their strategic plans for the next 5 years and stolen those. So then they do what's known as something called staging. They will find all those documents, they will zip them up into packages, and then they will exfiltrate them. So exfiltrate means to upload to a cloud service. Typically, these are ones that are don't record or log any activity. So they're completely anonymous. Essentially, they will upload all your data to those types of platforms, and then the next step, which is the one that is causes the most impact, is the obfuscation that they do. So what they do is to cause as much disruption as they can by first deleting any backups that they can see. So if you have mechanisms to back up data online, then they will look for those and they will delete them. And any types of backups that they can see, they will delete those backups. They will delete any logs if they can that have recorded any of their activity, and then they will drop the ransomware, which encrypts all the files that are left. And then finally, they make the extortion demands, and that can be they do a kind of financial assessment of the organization to see how much can they extort based on the size of the organization, so that it's not too big enough that they hope you can pay, but big enough to cause a problem and balance it off to the cost of recovery. One of the things they also do as part of that is threaten you with the fact that they'll release that information to the public if you don't pay, and often they will as a demonstration of this, they will probably release a few files to either the dark web or one of their breach websites as a show of proof that they have this information and can do this. Now, if you don't pay, sometimes they will increase the ransom demands over time, and then slowly start to release your data anyway, which is obviously a challenging circumstance to be in for any organization. So the way we've helped on some of these is kind of a multi-phased approach that often needs to be taken. First of all, there's an investigation that needs to happen. The second step is to try and contain and eradicate the attackers from the organization. And often we also help with kind of providing that strategic advice around what to do, when to do it, as well as helping provide information on comms and discussions with the insurers when things occur. And also we can help with recovery activities. But I suppose one of the biggest challenges is the investigation in and of itself. And at what point do you perform investigation versus recover the business? And it's often a tension between the two that needs to happen. You might have to take steps to perform some actions that will be the detriment to the other. But there might be very good reasons for that. So it's really important that in any event, in any major event, that you document the decisions that you take and the basis for those decisions at the time, because they might be the right decisions at the time with the information that you have available. And often when you're in the midst of an incident, it's very much a case of making decisions with incomplete information. The question's also asked, why can't we just recover? And if you do have backups, why don't we just recover and forget about the investigation? Which is a perfectly valid point. But the problem is you might have to do that. You might not have an option not to do the investigation for a whole bunch of reasons, not least of which is your insurers. So if you have cyber insurance that you can call upon, the insurers want to be happy and comfortable that if you recover back to normal activity, that the same thing's not going to happen again in another day or a week or a month. And there's a perfect example of that. So I'm sure most of you have heard of the logistics company Toll Group, who is based in Australia. They had an incident ransomware incident that affected a significant part of their environment that started in last January. They went through about 6 or 8 weeks of pain to recover their systems, only to be hit with ransomware again within a week of their recovery activities being complete, and they had to go through the whole pain again. Now, second time around it was somewhat easier, but it didn't negate the fact that they still had to do it, which was a significant cost and impact to that organization. In terms of the actual role that often needs to happen as part of the investigation, there's a whole bunch of exercises that need to take place, and this is some of the examples of what you might need to do. And I've talked about the insurers being one of those stakeholders, I suppose, in the midst of an incident that you need to kind of respond and manage to. But just as equally, the people who want to know what's going on might include your exec team, the board, external regulators, and your customers, not least of which. So being able to have a thorough understanding of how an organization has been breached or has become the victim of an attack like this is really, really important, so it doesn't happen again. And very often we find that the organizations, after they have gone through the pain of this, very often want to share their experience so that they can help others learn from the event, so they're not put into a similar situation in the future. One of the key steps is actually understanding who you can talk to when one of these occurs, and in terms of what would have helped in a number of these, there's a bullet point list of stuff that does help. I don't propose to go through any of these in that much detail, purely because each one of these is a topic in and of itself. But these are some of the critical controls or important controls that are really good to help an organization deal with an event when it occurs, or protect from the event. But other things that can, in terms of preparing for these, it's important to try and practice these things, and things like desktop exercises are really useful, but try and make them as real as possible if you're dealing with them, and try and think of the worst scenarios, because those are unfortunately the ones that you're not prepared for usually, and therefore the ones that probably need the most practice. And I've mentioned things like decision making and logic behind those decisions is an important step. Events like this are all consuming for organizations. They take up, significant resources, not least of which IT, but your comms, your legal, your customer facing teams, your overall management. It's actually really important to understand that this is not just an IT thing. And it really helps if you have someone in the room helping you with these types of events who may have done this before and has that experience. So what steps can you take as some takeaways? Well, just educate yourselves, understand what are the worst case scenarios that could occur. One of the ones that I've recently responded to resulted in a 98% disruption of the organization's server infrastructure, which covered multiple countries, and it literally ground their business to a halt. So you really need to understand what are the real worst case scenarios. Get some decent advice. Understand what's important to you as an organization, and and protect that. Understand what is your crown jewels, if you like. That's probably the best advice I could give you. Set the rules around how you will respond, and how you want your service providers and your teams to work together to respond when there is an event. And it's great to do the basics, but just don't do the basics. So no doubt you will have heard people talking about having good standards and policies and processes, and do things like patch your systems regularly. Those are all absolutely great things to do, but don't just rely on those. You need to kind of think about the I suppose some expectations around what more sophisticated monitoring or adaptive controls that you might need to do to protect yourselves. Because the attackers are always improving over time, and they're increasing in their sophistication. Unfortunately, organizations have to respond in the same way. The challenge is, of course, that as organizations, you need to get it right all the time. An attacker only has to get it right once to get in. And finally, don't assume it won't happen, because I'm sure you'll all have individual experiences of limited attacks or limited events that have affected your organizations in some shape or form. But don't assume those are the only ones that will occur. You need to think about the worst case. So I suppose finally, what can you take away to ask your own teams about what's happening in your organizations? And I suppose we can distill that down to 4 points. What controls do we have as an organization to protect against whatever event, whether it's a significant ransomware attack that compromises all our customer data or all our financial data or whatever that is. Ask them to tell you how effective those controls are, and then ask them how they know that they're effective, and get them to demonstrate it to you, so that you're really having a robust conversation about what the controls are that you have in place and how they're managing risk for your organization. That's me in summary. I'm going to hand it over, and if you have any questions that you want to ask or share, then happy to discuss.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and a fascinating and timely topic. Sadly, in light of COVID, when resources are focused on that response, that these are happening more frequently. Turning to a question of one of our members, many operators are using off-the-shelf security systems such as Norton 360, MS Cloud, etc. What is your view as to the security of these type of systems?
Great question. Thanks, Gary, for that. So inherently, there's nothing wrong with any or either of the off-the-shelf or any off-the-shelf systems. It's understanding the nature of what they can do for you. So if we're talking about Norton or other endpoint anti-malware controls, they are one in a number of tools that you should have to protect the environment. So there are equally a whole bunch of endpoint protection and anti-malware and antivirus solutions that would go alongside Norton, including Symantec, McAfee, Pan Cortex, Defender from Microsoft, all of which have their place. It's important that you don't just rely on one. I think that's probably the key takeaway. where we're talking about cloud services, that's a really interesting conversation. And particularly when we're talking about cloud environments like Microsoft Azure or Office 365, or a combination of the two, or we're talking about Amazon Web Services or Google Cloud. The key things with those types of offerings and services is to understand where the service provider's responsibility finishes and yours starts. Don't assume that just because you start running a service in a cloud environment that it is secure, because it will, the service provider like Amazon or Microsoft will do things up to a point, but then there's also an expectation on you to secure what you put on the platform. So it's really important to understand where that limitation and that demarcation is.
Thank you very much. You mentioned, Andrew, about ransomware attacks. How frequently do you see attacks occur essentially just for bragging rights? Attackers go in and just cause damage?
Multiple times a week. So we see that we, as part of our team, run a managed service for some clients, and we run that 24/7. We see events happening across the clients on that platform, and we have a dozen or so on it, and we see events every single day. That we're protecting those environments against. So these are, it's a constant state of attack that organizations are exposed to. It's just the method and mechanism that are continually evolving, I would say.
And if you were an attacker, where would you target?
I'd target New Zealand. So it depends on what they're after. If as I've said, from ransomware perspective, we're seeing more of a prevalence of attackers targeting companies rather than the opportunistic individual ones. So someone at home getting their machine ransomware and encrypted. It's painful and inconvenient at home, and it is not something that you want to experience. But we're certainly seeing more sophistication of the attacks, as I described, and the reason why they're going after organizations is because they have the deeper pockets to potentially pay a ransom. That's just a fact of life. The interesting situation is having that discussion in an organization as to whether you do pay a ransom. Now, it's not something we ever condone, but I know organizations that have decided to pay. One example was an organization, they had ransomware in their environment that had compromised some of their key customer-facing systems, and they were so concerned that they were unable to reproduce or replicate the transactions and the subsequent impact that would have on their business, that they decided to pay out. Now, this was not a large company, but I think they had a turnover of maybe $3 or $4 million, so not that big. And they paid out a ransom. I think it was about $70,000. But some of the larger ransoms that we're seeing, so one of the ones that we responded to, we're seeing the ransom values in hundreds of thousands easily. That's what the demands are coming through as.
Wow. So the FSC has members ranging from small organisations right up to significantly large organisations with parent companies overseas as well.
Hmm.
What would be the top 3 things you would recommend for a small business or a larger business to do right away?
So actually have an understanding of what routes are into your organization. Often many organizations don't necessarily understand that, particularly larger and more complex ones. I did a piece of work for a client recently where we found 52 systems on the internet that were either test or development systems that they weren't aware of. So actually understanding what your exposure is one of those things, and that comes back to the comment I made before, is understanding what it is you have that needs protecting, and put your controls around that. For a smaller organizations, it's comes back to that statement I made around do the basics, but don't just do the basics if you can. So the ASD from Australia produced something called the ASD Top 8, which is a series of key controls that any organization should implement to reduce risk. And those eight things would manage or mitigate a lot of exposures in a number in organizations. So certainly for the smaller organizations, they would be, the starting point at least, doing those and then moving on from there.
Okay, thank you. So just touching on that and to wrap up, where resources are limited, where would you recommend going to learn more? You mentioned the ASD top 8 things. Where else could our members go to read, learn, research, in addition to engaging external assistance?
So there's a whole variety of organizations out there, not least of which us. But there's good, you can get some good basic advice from, as I mentioned, the ASD website. CertNZ gives some really good advice as well, and which covers all types of organizations and individuals. So they have a focus ranging from individuals to large corporates. So they're a great source of information to understand a bit more about the topic and the risks and what you can do about this. As you, I suppose, gain knowledge and gain increased information and increased maturity, there is other organizations like the Center for Internet Security who give some great advice on standards and approaches that you can use to protect or harden systems, I suppose, if you want. And they give some great examples through their site, and most of the information there, I think, is free as well.
We've just had another question from a member,
Yep.
which I think is really valuable. Cyber insurance. Is this something that you can provide further insights
Yep.
on? Is it valuable? Is it expensive?
So to the expense component, it depends on the organization. So different organizations are treated differently by insurers. So it depends on how much cover you actually want to take out. But it's understanding what might you need to cover in that insurance is the important thing. So typically, cyber insurance, you need to understand the and compare policies to get the detail on this. But broadly, they will cover things like helping you respond to an incident. So getting an external party to help you out, to help you recover, or investigate the incident when it occurs. It may cover you for loss of revenue and things like that as well, just depending on the nature of the policy. It can be an important tool to help organizations weather a storm like this. I think it's a really important tool. But it's also important to understand the limitations of that. So making sure that you're not doubling up with other types of insurance that you may have. So you may have some policies, insurance around business resilience of various types. So understanding that there's, making sure that you're not doubling up on insurance is an important thing. Likewise, if it is a significant event for the organization and is likely to be therefore a significant cost, the insurers may actually use a loss adjuster to help manage the incident from their perspective, and they'll want to know a significant amount about what you're doing and what you've done and what you're going to do in the future to protect against the same thing happening again. And that can be a double-edged sword, because they'll want access to all the information around how you're investigating this and what controls you have in place. And as a result, they may make recommendations to the insurers that may not align with your needs. For instance, not paying out on the insurance because they don't think your controls are appropriate or effective. So it's understanding the risk around those things, because often they will ask you, when you take out the insurance, they'll ask you to fill out some sort of questionnaire about what controls that you have in place. And if you don't have those in place at the time of the incident, then that can obviously affect the claim.
And what are insurers' views on ransoms and paying ransoms? And is there a risk to a business if they did pay a ransom that they'd get targeted again?
So just the other point in the Q&A there. So sometimes, depending on the cover, they may actually that the payment of the ransom may be covered. I have seen policies with that in. Not all policies, because you get into some interesting ethical and moral dilemmas where when you pay the ransom, you're funding the proceeds of crime. So that can be therefore a completely different conversation. But to the question about if you pay out and you get the keys to unlock your files and that's all good, there is nothing to prevent them doing exactly the same to you a week later.
Absolutely. All right. We need to wrap it up there. Thank you so much, Andrew. I personally find this topic fascinating, and we aren't in a protected little bubble in New Zealand. It could happen to us. So please feel free to watch this recording again at your leisure on YouTube, or as I mentioned, on our events page on the FSC website. So thank you, Andrew, and thank you everyone for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.